All right, so this is the screencast on property rights. All right, so we talked about in previous screencasts and previous classes how for most goods and services, the market is a very efficient allocator of economic resources. That efficiency comes from the fact that usually in a market system there are well-defined property rights. All right, individual property rights allow market participants to engage in voluntary exchange. If I'm going to exchange something with you and you're going to exchange it with me, we have to know that I have the right to give that thing to you, and then once you have it, you have the right to enjoy and use that good without other people being able to just come and take it away from you, right? So the example I've been using is if I'm going to sell you my bike, it's in the shop today. You don't see it hanging there, but if I'm going to sell you my bike for $500, it means I value that $500 more than I value the bike, and you value the bike more than you value the $500. That kind of exchange can only take place if it's well defined that I own the bike and it's well defined that you own the $500. All right. If property rights aren't clearly defined, it's hard to trade, and there would be little incentive to trade, and there'd be little incentive to, for example, someone to produce a lot of things in order to sell them. All right. So many of the problems we're going to talk about in this set of screencasts will be of why resource allocation is hard or inefficient when property rights are not well defined. So when property rights aren't well defined, we often don't get efficient outcomes, right? And they can be ill defined for a couple of reasons. One of them being that they're just legally not well defined, and they maybe could be if we change the legal regime. The other is sometimes it's just technically difficult to enforce property rights, whether or not they are well defined or not. All right, so we're going to talk about those cases in this set of screencasts. But this screencast is just basically about property rights in and of themselves. So what are property rights? Well, property rights are a set of rights to engage in specific activities. All right, so we often think about property rights in terms of a piece of land, or your right to farm on your property, or your right to defend your property. But we're just talking about property rights are just a set of rights associated with a good that give you the right to engage in certain activities. All right, you can consume the good, you can enjoy the good, you can trade the good, you can sell the good, all those sorts of things that you can do with the good that you own. All right. Property rights, however, are rarely absolute. All right. Property rights often come with different responsibilities. All right. Keeping your property right usually comes with a set of things that you must do to maintain that property right. So you have to keep your home and land safe, or your home could be condemned as a danger to others. You have to maintain your car. If you want to drive it on public property, public lands, public roads, you have to maintain it at a certain level. You don't get to just burn tires in your yard if you want to, right? Your property rights have some limitations on them, all right? Property rights are often necessary for beneficial exchange, all right? Property rights promote mutually beneficial exchanges when they are clearly defined, all right? Most property rights are assigned to individuals, and so those property rights can be traded or sold. So often economists think about exchange, me selling my bike to you because I value the $500 more than you value the $500, and you value the bike more than you value the $500, right? That's what we're really exchanging, is the property rights over the two things. You're getting the property rights over the bike, I'm getting the property rights over the $500, all right? And so, again, that example I've been using is if those property rights are more valuable, then we can exchange, all right? As long as you have enough income and you value the bike more, we can bargain and come to a mutually beneficial exchange there, right? So what are some of the problems associated with poorly defined property rights, all right? Well, one of the problems is resources are not going to be allocated efficiently, all right? So how can someone who values a resource more pay someone who values it less if it's not clear who owns the resource, or that I can even transfer it, or that if you buy the bike from me that you can legally prevent people from using the bike? When property rights are poorly defined, we often end up with Pareto inefficient outcomes. We end up with outcomes where someone could be made better off without making someone else worse off, if only we could make the property rights more well-defined. All right. Another problem with poorly defined property rights is that it gives you very little incentive to conserve resources. If no one owns the resource, overuse could be a big problem. If I can't prevent you from consuming the resource, you can't prevent me from consuming the resource, but consuming the resource is a valuable thing, then we might run into a big problem in terms of conserving that resource. Another problem with poorly defined property rights is the incentive to produce. When property rights are poorly defined, there's very little incentive to produce new resources, because if I can't prevent you from taking it legally, why would I produce extra? Why would I produce more than that I needed to use if you can just walk up and say, hey, look, an extra bike, let me take that from you, right? So here I'm going to show a little supply and demand diagram that's going to illustrate some of the properties associated, well, it's going to illustrate some of the problems associated with having poorly defined property rights. So this is going to be the market for air pollution. So here is the price of air pollution on the y-axis and the quantity of air pollution on the x-axis. The demand curve, remember, for us represents the marginal benefit of each additional unit of something. Here, it's each additional unit of air pollution. And the marginal cost represents the opportunity cost of each additional unit of air pollution. All right. So what happens if property rights are not well defined? Well, if property rights aren't well defined, we will just get to a case where producers will produce because the benefit of producing pollution is beneficial for manufacturing, for coal plants, for steel plants. They will produce all the way up to where the marginal benefit they get from that additional unit of pollution is zero. All right. But if there was somehow, if we were able to have a market for pollution, the market price would give us the quantity of pollution where the marginal benefit of that pollution equals the marginal cost of that pollution. In short, producers would have to pay for the pollution that they're producing, and so they would probably pick a better level of pollution. We'll talk about in a later screencast why you might not want zero pollution and why you may want to try to develop a system that would give you something like this. But right now we're just hypothetically talking about how the absence of property rights leads to that very inefficient level of pollution. All right. Another problem is the overuse, get rid of my highlighting there, is the overuse of resources with poorly defined property rights. All right. So the example I'm going to use is in the 1800s, cattle versus buffalo. So here's a picture of a buffalo haul. So in the US in the 1800s, way more cattle was consumed, way more beef was consumed than was buffalo meat. But the buffalo were hunted almost to the point of extinction. Well, what's going on here? Well, the cattle were all owned. All right, they were in fenced-off barbed wire ranches and things like that, and someone owned those cattle. They could legally prevent you from consuming their cattle. They had all the property rights that came along with something being their private property. The buffalo, however, were held in common. The buffalo were just out on the plains. The land was owned by the government. They didn't have the ability to police whether people hunted the buffalo or not, even if they wanted to police it. Buffalo are actually pretty slow animals, and so it was pretty easy to go and kill lots of buffalo for both their meat and their hides. So one was held in common and was almost wiped out, and one was private property and it was maintained. We often use the joke as economists that, you know, chickens will never be hunted to the point of extinction. We will always have enough chickens to go around, even though we eat a hell of a lot of chicken. All right, so that's another way to think about it. Another example of overuse is that many endangered species suffer because their property rights are not well defined legally. All right, so African elephants, for example, are an endangered species. Usually, this is changing a little bit, but for the most part, they're held in common. And it's very hard for anyone to police the hunting of those elephants. And so many of the different types of elephants are close to extinction. Some endangered species suffer because their property rights are hard to enforce from a technical standpoint. All right, so the Atlantic cod is a fish that is almost to extinct, and even though there are all sorts of laws against using that resource or overusing that resource, it's almost impossible to enforce it. So even if you did want to say this is private property, it would be very hard to imagine a scenario in which you could do that for something like the Atlantic cod. All right. Another problem with the overuse of resources with poorly defined property rights is you get poor resource allocation. The efficiency of markets depends on clearly defined property rights where possible. Remember, efficiency is that we've gotten to a case where no one can be made better off without making someone worse off. In order for us to make the bargains and make the exchanges, to get to that point, we have to have the rights to trade the good. We have to have the ability to say, you now have the property rights over that good, and you give me a different good in exchange or money in exchange, and I now have the property right over that good or that exchange. So property rights are the thing that allow us to get to that efficient resource allocation. Okay, so this has been the screencast over private property rights, and I'll see you next time.